Professor Arend Lijphart, thank you so very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. In your typology of democratic systems, you contrast majoritarian and consensus models. To what extent do majoritarian systems, especially those lacking robust institutional checks, as seen in Hungary and India, enable the concentration of power that facilitates the risk of authoritarian or fascistic regimes?
Yes, I think this seems to be happening everywhere, or not everywhere, but in lots of places, that a government is in power and then gradually expands its power by step by step. Wait. I got another message here, and then you're specifically talking about the judicial system. I think it's important that the system is strong, and but that in democratic systems depends very much on other things. I think more important is that I guess that's the main message of my book, Patterns of Democracy, is that there is more sharing of power, so that we do not get a concentration of power. And some electoral systems make it very likely that you get that concentration of power. So like presidential systems, we have that in the United States at the moment. There's a great concentration of power. You have it in Britain. It can happen in parliamentary systems, but then typically it happens when the electoral system is what in Britain they call first past the post. Or, in the US it's usually called the plurality system. When you get a concentration of power, in the case of Britain, it is even in the hands of a party that did not win at all a majority of the vote. I mean, that the same thing was true with the first election of Trump. He actually had far fewer votes than Hillary Clinton. So that I think it's a weakness of presidential systems, and actually also of a parliamentary system like Britain. But I don't know, did I, perhaps I'm talking around your question rather than answering your question.
No, I think it was a good answer, Professor. Wonderful. Our second question is, the recent declaration you signed warns of a global authoritarian drift. How do you view the contribution of majoritarian democratic structures, particularly those favoring winner-takes-all outcomes, such as in the United Kingdom or the United States, to this resurgence of fascistic traits in contemporary politics?
Yes, obviously we see. I mean, I consider fascism to be, strongman rule is part of it. It is trying to organize the entire society, weaken civil society. I mean, that's anything that can challenge the authority of the single person ruler or the single party ruler. And weakening civil society means that you go against external powers, like in the United States, the federal system. The federal system, because there's decentralization, has some protection against the concentration of power. So that is one thing, the judicial system, and the rest of civil society too. We see that currently in the United States when the government under President Trump tries to weaken universities, tries to weaken journalists, the lawyers that may be opposed to the government, really kind of that this is a concentration of power. And what can we do about it? I signed that declaration just to call attention to the danger. I mean, that declaration in itself is not going to do have any specific effect. It's just, I think, that people should be more aware of the danger we face in democratic systems.
Right. In your co-authored article with Matt Quartrup, you demonstrate that majoritarian democracies are significantly more prone to fatal domestic terrorism. Do similar institutional vulnerabilities, like those evident in the United States post-January 6 or in Brazil under Bolsonaro, help explain the susceptibility of the systems to authoritarian populist mobilization today?
Yes, actually, my entire work, and specifically patterns of democracy, shows that consensus democracies work better than majoritarian democracies, and the old wisdom in political science was that you need majoritarian democracy in order to have strong enough government that could run things effectively. And what I have found in a comparative study of 36 countries is that the idea of a strong and effective government is not the province only of majoritarian systems. Consensus systems do just as well, or even a little bit better, and then consensus systems are much better at doing other things, like that when there is consensus in a government, there's likely to be less danger of terrorism, and there's a whole lots of other things. I think you're probably going to get to that, like there's better women's representation, better minority representation. The population tends to like its government better, and so on. So it really all kind of boils down to that. And then the question is, and perhaps I'm making this answer too long, is that how do you create a consensus system? And I think there are two mechanisms that are especially important, and that is parliamentary government rather than presidential government, and proportional representation rather than majoritarian elections. Now, those two things are not going to be, if that's installed, it's not a necessary condition for success. I would say it's a necessary sufficient condition for success, not a sufficient one. Let's just say, create it, and there's no guarantee that it's going to work, but it's more likely to work than the alternative.
Right. In Democracy in the 21st Century, you argue that democracies that ignore the institutional superiority of parliamentary government and proportional representation risk degradation. In the light of backsliding cases like Tunisia, Turkey, and Israel, what constitutional reforms would be most effective in preventing the kind of democratic erosion outlined in the declaration?
Yeah, because there is just no, when you talk about Israel, Israel is basically, of course, has a parliamentary government. Turkey started with a parliamentary government and switched to presidentialism. It's just I don't know really. There is no guarantee that that it will work, and still I think I listened to a lecture by one of the authors of the important book that's called How Democracies Die, and it shows how gradually I guess their main point is democracies can die by a revolution or by a coup d'etat. That is also that can happen in both systems. In a presidential government, it could be the president that decides with the aid of the armed forces to take over power, or the armed forces simply take over power. And I asked the author, but does it make a difference whether you have a presidential or parliamentary government? And he said, "Oh, I see that there is a political scientist in the audience," and that was me. But he said, "Yes, in presidential government you have a greater chance that this will happen than in parliamentary government. But there's obviously just no guarantee whatsoever to ward off this danger."
Right. Your 1985 work on electoral rules illustrates the democratic benefits of proportional representation. Given the rise of exclusionary populism in countries with first-past-the-post systems such as the UK, US, and India, how might proportional representation systems act as a structural safeguard against democratic backsliding?
Well, it's I think in the case of the U.S., it would help to have proportional representation. Like right now, even you do have a presidential system, but the president really controls the legislature completely. If you had proportional representation, there would likely be a multi-party system, and there would be much less of a chance that the president could control the legislature as much as happens right now in the United States. In fact, this past week, you could see that it happened. In the case of India, I wrote about India and the possible dangers for Indian democracy in the 1990s, and I said, well, the danger is that an authoritarian party, namely the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, would come to power. How can you prevent that? The BJP does not have a popular majority. Well, what the Congress Party should have done when they were in power, they should have introduced proportional representation. And I think that would have, again, I say there's no guarantee, but I think it would have been less likely that the BJP would emerge as the strongest party in India. And actually the BJP has been engaged in this democratic backsliding. They have been, the minorities have not been as protected and so on. Well, we know all what is going on in India has changed from a liberal democracy to now an illiberal democracy. It's not the kind of shining example of a big country in Asia that manages to be a stable democracy.
Right. Given your long-standing critique of power concentration in majoritarian systems, how can electoral reform, particularly the adoption of proportional representation or mixed member systems as seen in Germany or New Zealand, disincentivize authoritarian tendencies and promote institutional pluralism in increasingly polarized democracies?
Well, it's again, if you have the and you mentioned Germany and New Zealand, they basically, I mean, that's a mixed member system. They're basically proportional. Um, it's just less likely that an extreme party will come to power. I mean, it's kind of amazing to think that, think about Germany in the early 1930s. How did Hitler come to power? Hitler never won an election. He was defeated in the presidential election by Hindenburg, and then in the last free parliamentary election, the Nazi Party won more than 40% of the vote. But there were other conservative parties. The president then appointed Hitler to be chancellor, and that, of course, was the beginning of the complete end of democracy in Germany. But the important thing to remember was that even in a huge Germany was in a big crisis at that time, but even in that big crisis, and the Nazi Party saying they would solve everything, they still did not win a majority. And that obviously in proportional representation, parties can still win a majority, but it's just less likely that it will happen.
Right. Your 2010 research on democratic quality highlights the representational benefits of consensus systems for women and minority groups. In the light of resurgent anti-gender and exclusionary rhetoric in countries like Poland, Italy, Turkey, and the US, how crucial is electoral system design in sustaining democratic inclusiveness and resilience?
Yes, I think indeed what proportional representation does is more likely that women and members of a minority get representation, and if they get representation, they get a political voice and have some political power. I remember being in New Zealand and listening to an interview with the woman prime minister. This was after the change to proportional representation, and there was a chance to make her party actually propose kind of putting limits on proportional representation, and she was asked, do you favor that? And she said, well, just wait a minute. Proportional representation has made it easier for women to get representation, and she pointed to the larger number of women in her own party. And so she said, well, but let's just a little bit wait with limiting proportional representation, because she was then thinking of protecting the women members of her own party. That if you get representation by women and by members of a minority, it's more likely to be also representation in favor of women and minorities.
Right. In an era marked by digital disinformation and epistemic fragmentation, phenomena actively weaponized in democratic erosion cases like India, Brazil, and Hungary, how must electoral and media institutions evolve to uphold rational, inclusive discourse central to your model of consensus democracy?
I guess I have no good answer to that. What do you do about the social media when all of these voices, and especially extreme voices, come in? I think when you kind of it's a little bit like what has happened with the primary election in the United States. The idea was to give everybody, and especially the voters more influence. What happens, in fact, with these primary elections, that the turnout is very low. And who turns out? It's the more extreme voters who turn out, who feel passionately. So instead of better representation, the primary system has become a vehicle for more extreme views. And so it's the same thing, I think, with the social media. It's that the extreme voices are getting special attention. Now, I don't know. Do you have an answer to that? I don't know what to do. Turning off the social media obviously is impossible. People would not like that. But I have no good answer to to turn off this potential and I think a real danger of extremism in democratic societies.
Right. The declaration you signed warns that fascism historically erodes the separation of powers. How can the institutional diffusion of authority in consensus democracies serve as a bulwark against executive aggrandizement, especially in light of how Erdogan in Turkey and Modi in India have centralized power?
Yeah, if you have, and again, I always come back to the same answer. If you have a parliamentary government and proportional representation, you're more likely to have a diffusion of power. But well, of course, in India, they do not have proportional representation, which they really should have. An institutional diffusion of authority. Now you're talking about, for instance, a presidential system where you have separation of power, and a federal system with considerable decentralization. I think that a federal system with a high degree of decentralization is one way of decreasing the danger of fascism and the concentration of power. The problem with federalism, for instance, in the United States, but also in countries like Brazil and Argentina, is that this means giving special representation of the states. In the case of the United States, it's equal representation of the states of the federation. And this means that there's a huge inequality of population. So you have a problem that is not a necessary element of federalism, but it often goes together with that. It's in the case of Germany, it's also Germany is a federal system, and I think that is helpful for its democracy. And there is some inequality there too, but not as extreme as in the United States, Brazil, and Argentina.
Right. In systems where populist leaders have weakened judicial independence and neutralized parliamentary oversight, as seen in Israel's controversial judicial overhaul and Hungary's court packing, how might constitutional design principles be leveraged to insulate democratic institutions from authoritarian encroachment?
Yeah, I guess I could come back to saying there is just no absolute instruments that will do it. It's just less likely when you have a good proportional representation system and parliamentary government. But as you see in the case of Israel, they have a parliamentary government and they do have proportional representation. But still, there is one party and its allies that has power and is using it to slowly erode this. That's the idea of in the book How Democracies Die. If you have a group of a party or a president that has this power and aims to undermine the system, aims to try to concentrate power in one party or one person's hands, then it's not a guarantee. But again, I think it's just less likely in parliamentary systems and proportional representation.
Right. Your functionalist rationale for consensus democracy emphasizes broad-based inclusion. How can inclusive multi-party coalitions help depolarize political discourse and counteract the us versus them narratives instrumentalized by authoritarian populists in cases like Venezuela or El Salvador?
Yeah. It's if you have especially in the highly divided and perhaps polarized society, it's important to include parties, and there's a need for compromise even with parties which have different different points of view. I often think that it is better when you have extreme parties, as you have in Germany, in Belgium, and in the Netherlands. Better to try to include them in government rather than to have this what in Belgium I think is called the cordon sanitaire, kind of keeping the extreme parties out. What has happened before in the Netherlands, the tendency has been to cut them in, and then it shows these extreme parties are not actually very effective. They don't have good people to put in the government. So basically, it's a way of kind of destroying themselves. Right now, of course, the Dutch cabinet has fallen because the party of Wilders, which is the main extreme party, was in the government, now given up, and it looks in the opinion polls that they are going to lose votes. So they have kind of what you call by being included and by being shown not to work well, they have weakened themselves.
Right. And lastly, Professor Lijphart, the anti-fascist declaration urges strong international institutions. How might the core principles of consensus democracy, such as proportionality, minority protection, and power sharing, inform the reform of multilateral bodies like the UN, EU, or African Union to more effectively resist authoritarian influence and erosion of global democratic norms?
I wish I know. I wish I would know this. One thing I can say is that actually international organizations, like the United Nations, have actually pivoted to a preference for proportional representation, for instance, in order to increase minority representation. That is what happened in Iraq, for instance, and that I think is a big change in the kind of the general attitude toward government reform and electoral reform. I mean, the main people who had influence in government and politics used to be admirers of the British system of of government. But in the case of the United Nations, for instance, they push toward proportional representation in Iraq, and we all know that Iraq is not a democracy that is working very well, but the international institutions are already in favor of this kind of thing, and of course. I would say they should listen to experts who know the specific country and can steer away from the idea that you need a strong government in order to have a good government. I mean. Strong governments can make decisions more easily than, say, power sharing or a coalition government, but those easy decisions are often wrong decisions. So I think we obviously we need a change in overall culture, and I think there is this interesting interaction between culture and structure. If you have for instance, a more consensual culture, you're more likely to build consensual structures. But if you try to introduce consensual structures, and again, I always come back to parliamentary government, proportional representation. That is my mantra. Then you're more likely to succeed.
Professor Arend Lijphart, thank you so very much for your time. Appreciate it.